Everyone likes a detective story, but there's something wrong even with a good one. You see, you yourselves are not the detective. You don't see all the evidence. Well, here then is your chance to work on equal terms with the police and to match your wits with theirs and the criminals. Now, in the following stories taken from my notebook, you'll have all the evidence placed before you exactly as presented to me. Now try your skill on the case of the stolen boy. Here are the facts. Osmond Vincent was a best-selling author. He had a comfortable private fortune. He was a widower with one boy, Johnny, aged 11, whom he worshipped. The case broke at 8 o'clock on the Sunday morning when Vincent phoned Scotland Yard with the news that his son had been kidnapped. It was close on 8:30 when I reached the residence. Mr. Vincent had already explained that his son was suffering from bronchitis and that his nurse governess, Miss Joan Vida, had been sleeping in the boy's room for the past few nights, which explained the two beds. The ladder outside the open window indicated the kidnapper's method of entry and exit. A small hole sufficient to allow the passage of a man's hand had been cut in the glass close to the latch, and there were scattered fragments of glass on the floor below the window. The note pinned on the pillow was hand-printed in indelible pencil on a sheet of paper, obviously torn from a cheap writing block, such as may be bought for a shilling at any of the big stores. The message was brief and to the point. A small bottle lay on the floor beside the boy's bed. It was empty. It had the characteristic sickly reek of chloroform. I handled it carefully to avoid disturbing possible fingerprints, although most criminals are smart enough to wear gloves these days. The nurse governess, Joan Vida, walked in. I soon put her at her ease, gave her a cigarette, and asked her to tell me in her own words just what had occurred.
I retired soon after 10 o'clock last night. Just before getting into bed, I glanced out of the window. Chill mist was rising from the lake, so I closed and latched the window. I must have fallen asleep almost right away. Then something woke me during the night. I sat up, startled. Then I heard a tinkle of glass on the floor. As I switched on the light, the man wearing a mask climbed into the room. I opened my mouth to scream.
Here, Joan broke down. She resumed her statement a moment or two later.
When I came round later, I found myself bound and gagged. Poor little Johnny's bed was empty. I struggled to free myself and tried to shout. it was useless. I lay there for what seemed ages until a maid entered just before 8 o'clock with the early morning tea.
When Joan had completed her statement, I sent her back to her room, told her to take a couple of aspirins and lie down for a while. A moment later, the father of the missing boy came in. Tragedy was written on his face.
I wondered, have you been able to learn anything?
Don't worry, sir, you'll soon have your son back.
You mean, you know?
That lady that's just left here is in this up to her neck.
Joan, but how on earth?
I'm sorry, sir, I can't explain now. Meet me downstairs in my car in a few minutes. Yes, it really was simple. Joan had made a very bad slip, and I spotted it. Well, I went along to her room, opened her door. She appeared to be asleep. Suddenly, she opened her eyes, saw me. She knew I knew. Her face registered fear and dismay. And now I said grimly, we'll have the truth. She was pretty hard-boiled and denied everything at first, but when I dropped a hint that maybe she'd get off lighter if she played along with me, she came clean. An hour later, Mr. Vincent and I were in town, making our way through mean streets towards a mews situated at the back of a deserted warehouse. I got my gun ready in case of trouble, told Mr. Vincent to keep a sharp lookout, tried the door. There was no sign of life about the place. I decided to forget the regulations and break in. The door appeared to be securely fastened, so I got out my knife and forced the window catch and climbed in. The place had that smell peculiar to long disuse. I entered what appeared to be the living room. A slight moan drew my attention to the corner of the room. I whipped off the blanket. There was the boy, safe and unharmed except for a few bruises. As I cut him loose, his father hurried in. Young Johnny staggered to his feet, threw himself into his father's arms. Well, we got the boy back safe and sound, and little the worse for his experience. Before the day was out, I'd rounded up the rest of the gang. Now, I suppose that some of you wonder how I got wise to the fact that the nurse was lying. Or did you all spot it? Well, for the sake of those of you that did not spot it, we'll go back to the boy's room. Remember, Joan told me that she heard a tinkle of glass, and a moment later the window opened and a man climbed into the room. Well, there's the window. Note the ladder. The man must have been standing on that ladder when he apparently broke the window, unfastened the latch, opened the window and climbed in. Impossible, isn't it? When he broke the glass and unfastened the latch, he couldn't have opened the window because the top of the ladder is in the way. Did this problem fool you? Well, you still have another chance to beat the inspector at his own game by solving the case of the hairless guest. Here are the facts. A widowed Mrs. Hannah ran a small boarding house in Bloomsbury, assisted by one maid, a young girl called Anna Powell. Mrs. Hannah had a weakness, jewellery, of which she had a considerable quantity. Now, at the time of her death, she had two male boarders, a Mr. Knoll and a Mr. Walters. It was exactly 6:30 on the Friday when the maid phoned the police. Within 10 minutes I was at the boarding house, only to find Mrs. Hannah lying dead across her bed. It was a brutal crime. There were no less than 3 stab wounds, 1 in her chest and 2 in her back. And from the amount of blood lost, it was clear that the murderer must have got some on his clothing, as she'd obviously put up a stiff fight before she died. I glanced round the room. The motive stuck out a mile: robbery. I had already learned of deceased's fondness for jewellery, and the empty jewel cases scattered around certainly bore this out. The large jewel case had evidently held a necklace of some sort, and I was intrigued by the fresh and still moist blood stain inside the lid, which made it clear that the case had been handled by the murderer after the crime. Unfortunately, there was no hope of securing any fingerprints, as the surface of the case was rough and wouldn't have retained any prints. My next step was to get a statement from the maid. So I locked the bedroom door and pocketed the key. I went downstairs to the kitchenette, where I found the maid sipping a cup of tea. She looked pretty well all in to me, but I immediately eliminated her. She couldn't have stabbed a blue bottle, let alone Mrs. Hannah, of whom she was undoubtedly very fond. So I accepted her cup of tea and let her tell her story in her own way. Now you tell me just in your own words exactly what happened.
Well, Mrs. Hannah and the two boarders finished their tea at about 5:15.
Yes?
And Mrs. Hannah rose and went into the lounge where she sat reading her evening paper.
And then?
A moment or two later, Walter and Noel got up and went upstairs to their room.
I see. Well?
I cleared the dining room table and washed up the crockery. From here, I had a clear view of the hall and the staircase.
Yes?
I was actually in here from tea time onwards. The door was ajar, and nobody could have gone up or come down without my knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Just as I was wiping the last of the cups, I heard the lounge door open. I looked up, and I saw the mistress cross the hall and go up the stairs.
The maid went on to say that 10 minutes later, as she was doing a bit of ironing, she heard somebody coming down the stairs. She glanced up and saw Harold Noel descending wearing his raincoat. He took a walking stick from the hall stand and went out. Almost as soon as the door had closed on him, the telephone bell rang. Ada put down the iron and ran into the hall. It was a call for Mrs. Hannah. She put down the receiver and ran upstairs to fetch her mistress. When she entered the bedroom, she saw, to her unutterable horror, that her mistress was dead. She shrieked. A moment or two later, Steve and Walter ran into the room. Well, that was about all that the girl could tell me. Nothing in the bedroom had been touched. She and Mr. Walter had left the room almost at once, and she had then telephoned the yard. A fact was plain. The murderer was either Noel or Walter. A few moments later, I returned to the scene of the crime. Some women have a queer taste in perfume. I inspected the sole of the dead woman's left shoe. As I expected, there were distinct traces of powder. I swung round as the door opened and Noel entered, followed by Walter. For some reason, I took an instant dislike to Walter on sight. The men's faces told me nothing, as they merely expressed that uneasiness common to most people, especially the innocent, when in the presence of a police officer. Yet I reminded myself, one of them had brutally killed Mrs. Hannah. As I reconstructed the crime, the murderer had slipped into the bedroom while Mrs. Hannah was in the lounge. As he was rifling the jewel cases, Mrs. Hannah entered, caught him in the act. There was a furious struggle in which the poor woman received her death wounds. Something clicked in my mind. Yes, the solution was obvious. Well, ladies and gentlemen, right there I knew the identity of the murderer. There were two clues pointed unmistakably to the criminal. Now, was the murderer Noel or Walters? Well, for the benefit of those of you that can't make up your mind, I will explain the solution. You remember the Jewel case? As I have already mentioned, the fresh blood stain inside the lid proved that the murderer had handled the case after he stabbed Mrs. Hannah. Now note the comb lying across the lid. Why should the comb have been found there? There could be but one answer. The murderer himself must have used it and dropped it down carelessly afterwards. Again, the answer was simple. There'd been a desperate struggle in that room. The murderer got pretty dishevelled. He dare not be seen by his fellow boarder or the maid in that state. It's simple deduction to assume that he'd want to tidy himself before leaving the bedroom. Hence the use of the dead woman's comb. One look at those two men told me all that I wanted to know. You see, Walter is as bald as a coot. Probably hasn't needed a comb for years. Thus, I was able to eliminate him, leaving Noel logically indicated as the murderer. The second clue was as logical. I have already stressed that the murderer must have got blood on his clothes during the struggle, and I had noticed a queer thing about Noel's overcoat. A man always fastens his coat over from left to right, whereas a woman fastens hers the reverse way, that is, from right to left. Why was Noel wearing a coat fastened the wrong way over? The answer came to me in a flash. Supposing he had been wearing his coat when he entered the bedroom. Supposing he had got blood on the front of it during the struggle. How could he hide it from view? Why, by lapping the front over the other way round, from right to left. Something in my face must have alarmed Noel. He glanced wildly round the room and made a bolt for the door. He didn't get very far. I had a constable planted at the bottom of the stairs. Now, when I examined the coat later, I found a large blood stain on the front, low down on the left-hand side, exactly where I had expected to find it. Well, we recovered the stolen jewellery, and Noel paid the extreme penalty in due course. Now, I wonder how many of you solved that problem.